Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio. I'm your host for today's radio show, James Phillips from the UK chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement and TZM Education. Hope you're doing well out there, guys. The subject of today's show is an interview between myself and Peter Anderson from a group called Vocaleyes. Peter very kindly came to London ZDAY 2016 to give a talk on what Vocaleyes is all about, and it was a very excellent talk. I won't go into too much detail. You'll find out during the interview what it is all about and why it is connected with what the Zeitgeist movement advocate. Just a brief piece of news or request, so to speak, is we are accepting submissions for this radio show. Please don't be shy. The only way you learn is by doing. So please do see what sort of contribution you feel you could make to this radio show if you are a member of this movement. The more voices and the more varied voices we have on the radio, the better, showing that we are a global movement. And so if you want to make a submission, please do so to submit@thezeitgeistmovement.com. And it would also be a good idea to get in touch with me as well on Facebook. That's James Phillips. Send me a message on there, or jamesshock@hotmail.co.uk. The only real requests is decent sound quality. Don't put unsolicited material in the middle of your radio shows, and obviously try and make it as entertaining as possible. Of course, everybody's idea of that is slightly different, but yeah, that's about it. We definitely need some help on this. These interviews that I've decided to conduct with all the speakers from our London event has been relatively painless in terms of time consumption, which is against me quite a bit at the moment, which is why I haven't been putting out such a volume of radio shows, and the fact that I think we just need more voices on the radio. Your submissions would be more than welcome. So please do feel free to do that, and if you've got any questions, get in touch. Ultimately, as a movement that advocates a shift in people's values and understandings towards what would actually comprise some sort of sustainable socioeconomic system that meets human needs adequately, we need to make sure that we have regular, consistent, decent output from our main communication source, being this radio show, or at least a regular communication source to the rest of the movement. So please do get involved, and that would be much appreciated. So the following interview is a bit of an epic one. Peter has a lot of very interesting things to say, so I don't interject very much in this interview. I just let him go for it, because I think he talks a lot of sense and has a lot of interesting ideas on how we might initiate a transition to a better world for everyone. So without further ado, I give you Peter Anderson from Vocaleyes. We would like to welcome Peter Anderson to TZM Global. Hi Peter, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks James. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thanks, very well. So I think possibly the best place to start is with just a brief introduction to yourself and who you were representing at ZDAY London 2016.
Sure, yeah, no problem. So my name is Peter Anderson. I was there actually representing a project called Vocaleyes. Company is called Vocaleyes Digital Democracy, and does what it says on the tin, really, which is a digital democracy platform. I think I was probably better known to TZM through the original work of Peter Joseph, as he was advocating for the global resource management system. So back in 2003, I was working on a project called Localeyes with an L, and the idea of Localeyes was to create a comprehensive community resource. We'll go into this in a bit more detail later, I'm sure. But when I made myself known to some of the people at TZM, they pointed out that actually what I was working on was a potential route map to achieving Peter Joseph's vision. And that's really where it started. So I've developed various relationships and got to know various people in the movement since then. And we're delighted to be invited to talk at ZDAY.
That sounds fantastic. It's always lovely when you start to see something that's actually practical and effective start to take root. It adds some meat to the bones, so to speak. And did you? So just to clarify, you didn't sort of see the zeitgeist movement and that inspired you to start Vocaleyes. So what was it that sort of instigated the inspiration for it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, James. What's always been missing for me has been the route map, the practical route map. There's an awful lot of talk about the problems in the world, and the conferences that we go to. A lot of awareness raising, and Zeitgeist was doing a similar thing, really. Peter Joseph certainly opened my eyes to lots of different things, myth busting for sure, and has very much as true today as it was when he released the videos. When it was that, back in 2006 or something, 2008, something like that. But yeah, you're right. So I've been working on a project called Localeyes since 2003. So by the time Peter Joseph had launched his videos, I'd already been working on this Localeyes project for 3 years or so. And the whole idea of Localeyes was to create a comprehensive resource for and how I got into that really was being in IT and providing websites and web services to businesses. It was very apparent to me that the social sector was very disempowered as far as technology was concerned, and really not leveraging the technology. And it was anyone with the money really had access to these amazing communication tools. And obviously most social enterprises haven't got much money, and many of them are sort of technophobic and maybe intrinsic and certainly community minded. So even the word technology really, it can be a bit of a turn off for them. And I realized that if we're going to really do some capacity building with the social sector, then we not only needed to sort of offer them all the technologies for free, but we also needed to train up people that would sort of handhold the process of them using these tools. And all of that really started one day just by looking at the local community website. And standard community website, HTML. And I was asking myself, well, what's on here? And you've got some minutes from the local council and a little bit of history and this sort of stuff, maybe a gallery. And then I started asking myself, well, what's not on here? And the list just started to grow and grow and grow. I mean, there weren't any groups on there. There weren't any events. There weren't any skills. There was nothing about people. There was nothing about businesses or their promotions or their news. There was nothing about the horticulture or the geology or the carbon footprint or the happiness index. There was just, the list just grew and grew and grew. And actually a lot of these things that I've mentioned, even car sharing and free cycling and swapping, and it was just endless. A lot of these things all existed back then and exist today on separate websites, but certainly not in one integrated platform. And the idea of there being an integrated platform made up of all these layers where the data could then cross-pollinate, and where you could go to one place and really start to get a picture of what resources exist within the community. That idea of creating that comprehensive community resource sort of came to me back in 2003, and I initially called it Carrot. I thought, the future's bright and the future's orange, and obviously carrots make you see better. But and then later renamed it Localeyes, in terms of seeing everything that is local. And so I ended up working on that project till about 2008, applying for lots of different grants. You're probably familiar with Unlimited, which supports social entrepreneurs. I managed to received Unlimited Level 1 and Level 2, and more recently was a beneficiary of the Unlimited Fast Growth Award and various other different awards from the Ministry of Justice and this sort of stuff. And that kind of was the journey up till about 2008, when it was a heck of a week actually. I ended up being nominated for a Revolutionary Award by Number 10, and was invited up to London, and was with about 20 other social entrepreneurs, and obviously Gordon Brown made his presence, and it was runner-up in the category, and Nesta announced that Localeyes was the one to watch out of all of the social innovation in the UK and in that competition. So, on a real high at the beginning of the week, and then by the end of the week, my doctor had called me up and told me I had only 5% kidney function, and so that led me on quite a different journey, to sort of reevaluate the project at that point. It was a hell of an introduction. It's difficult to give an introduction without giving your life story, isn't it? I told you.
Yes. Before we came on air, you did say that, but there's no problem with a life story if it's that interesting. You certainly have been a busy boy. So and a very impressive list of accolades there as well. I mean, what was the sort of the first place that it started to be used practically, and are there organisations it fits better than others? I mean, I think it's used for possibly some councils and schools and things, and it'd be interesting to sort of flesh out exactly the practicalities of everyday digital democracy that goes into those organisations, perhaps.
Yeah, well, it's easy to get confused, James, but up to this point, all I've been speaking about is Localeyes with an L, and I never managed to finish building it to the point where we could actually practically apply it. And so there is a beta version of Localeyes built, but the challenge with all of these things is the engagement strategy. How do you get people to use it, especially when you're underfunded and haven't got a massive marketing budget. And obviously with my capacity being reduced around that time, we came up with a strategy that actually there's this one layer within this comprehensive community resource that is sort of has a universal appeal, and that was the layer of ideas and resources and crowdsourcing, essentially. Because I'd started to research that and started to ask myself, well, how do local organisations and local councils make their decisions? And actually, what had prompted this was the Transition Town movement coming into play. Again, I think that was a couple of years. That was about 2006. So I'd been working on this project for about 4 years before Rob Hopkins started launching the Transition Town, in Totnes and then through Glastonbury and this sort of stuff. And these speakers, I was going to all these conferences, and the leading speakers were saying this common theme of that grassroots democracy and local empowerment and bottom-up projects, this sort of stuff. These were the answer to these big problems, that it had to be a sort of a grassroots movement. And so when I'd heard this about 3 or 4 times, I asked myself, well, what's the most basic question here I could ask myself? So I asked myself, well, what does democracy look like today in the UK? And I did a little bit of research, and you come up with this ward structure. There's 10,000 wards in the country, and ward councils, community councils. So I started talking to these ward councils, and I said, well, how do you make decisions? And they were perfectly honest with me, and they would say things like, well, most of our decisions are based on guesswork, or he who shouts loudest, And then I started talking to the residents, and I said, well, what connection do you have with local democracy, with your local ward and your local councillors? And most people had absolutely no idea what ward they lived in, and no idea who their representatives were. So to me, this was a bit of a revelation, really, in terms of, well, hear all these leading speakers saying that the problem is grassroots democracy, and that you look at grassroots democracy and the practicalities of it, and it's non-existent. You know, it's a black hole. So that became the elephant in the room for me, and then I thought, well, you know, I'm going to start working on that aspect of it until someone else does. And even today, it's, you know, even though that was discovered this in about 2008, even today there's no system in place for democracy at that level. You mean you've got a lot of progress being made with organisations like Avaz and 38 Degrees, and obviously 38 Degrees has started to do some local stuff, but it's nowhere near the sort of platform that you could imagine and envisage where local residents are fully engaged with the decision-making process at the local level, you know, at the ward and sort of district levels. And these were the so this is where we basically decided to put our focus, because it would seem that almost everybody has a community of interest, and you know, is prepared to get engaged in some sort of community, whether it's their geographic community or maybe the community that of their school, and trying to improve the school, improve the learning environment of for their children, or maybe it's their workplace and, you know, becoming a part of the staff community or learner community within student unions, this sort of stuff. So I ran a pilot in a geographic community in Pembrokeshire, and I just enabled local people to suggest ideas to improve the community. And I went out to a couple of events, you know, church bazaars, school events, this sort of stuff, just raised some awareness. And within a couple of weeks, we had, you know, 60 or 70 people engaged. They'd rated and debated a list of ideas, and I publicised those priorities then in the local community diary. And that created a lot more interest. And this was the first time that this community of about 1,500 people had ever seen their own priorities, you know, so it was really interesting. And what fascinated me most was that actually most of the ideas that had been suggested were sort of green ideas. You know, the top rated idea being to create to start a local organic food box scheme. There was wind energy in there, you know, organic food at the Londis, and cleaning up the beaches and all of this sort of stuff. So this was kind of another revelation, really, because you had these green groups, you know, like the transition movement, sort of trying to reach out to communities, saying, you know, you should be getting into green energy, or you should be starting to grow your own local food and this sort of stuff. Whereas actually, if you go into the community and empower them to ask the question and say, how can you improve your community? They come up with all those ideas themselves, and you're actually starting them on a journey of, you know, creating those same projects, but with local ownership, if you know what I mean. And so the food box scheme itself ended up coming into fruition within about 6 weeks, and about 40 people committed to paying £5 to £10 a week for the food box scheme, and you know, so from this sort of combination of digital, face-to-face, and media, here had come some practical solutions. And you know, it wasn't the only one. The local shop started changing some of its produce, and interestingly, the local fish and chip shop, an idea had been put on to change the packaging at the local fish and chip shop, and the owner called me up and said, well, I want you to get rid of that idea on your website. And I said, well, I can't, you know, it's not up to me, as someone else has suggested that. And I said, well, she said, well, how do I get rid of that idea? And I said, well, you can action it. You know, you could change your packaging from polystyrene to something recyclable. That's what people want. And she said, well, what if I don't? And I said, well, at some point, if there's enough weight in the community, someone's probably going to print out these results and come and knock on your door and say, this many people think you should change your packaging. They might even take it to a project where they decide which type of packaging you could change it to. She says, well, I can't, you know, because it's going to cost too much. I said, well, how much is it going to cost you? She said, well, at least a penny per person. I said, we'll put a sign in the door, you know, that we're going to charge an extra penny for recycling packaging. And anyway, she hung up, and a couple of weeks later, she changed the packaging. So I know these are sort of small and might sound like trivial projects, but you can imagine the amount of discussion that's created in the local community and hoo-ha, and I think it's these small wins that empower people, to maybe move on to bigger projects. If we can crowdsource these small things and take local ownership of them, and also if we can crowdsource those and scale them up across all communities, then we can start to envisage a more sustainable world, and that's sort of the going from the bottom, the grassroots, to the larger vision. That's the grander vision that we hold, is that if we can actually take these local projects and crowdsource them with local ownership in the local communities, and then take that to scale and replicate them across, let's say, the 10,000 communities in the UK, that they consider them and adapt them and crowdsource them, then you can start to imagine, us moving and gaining some real traction. So for me, it's not so much about innovation. I think that you could stop innovation tomorrow and just focus on replication. If we just replicated all the best projects that we've ever seen, and the stuff that's emerging on TED or, on your Facebook, where you might see a vertical farm or a digital currency or a repair cafe or whatever it is, there's some fabulous projects out there. If within a short space of time of seeing those inspirational videos, they could be seeded as ideas into your local community, into your district, for local people to then probably learn about them for the first time. I mean, it was a little video on TED, that I learned about vertical farming only about 6 months ago. And you learn that it's potentially about 20 to 40 times more efficient than farming on arable land. And that you realise that actually this is a business that you could bring to the city centre. So you've got all of these areas throughout the UK. Some of them are called BID districts, BID districts. But you've got a lot of people trying to regenerate their high street, and I think a lot of people are trying to bring retail back to the high street. The idea that you could actually bring production, such as vertical farming, such as 3D printing. You've probably seen various 3D printing shops opening up into the city centre. Maybe combine that with education. It's a whole shift in the way that people might think of regenerating their area.
I think that sounds fantastic. It's certainly given me a lot of pause for thought there. I liked what you were saying about duplication, project duplication. That is, it's often something I say, that we all think that our own pet project's got it has validity, when actually, really, there's someone else doing something very similar just around the corner. And if we harnessed our efforts and focused in on making sure that we sort of jump on the same boat, so to speak, that would certainly help. And I'd always implore people who think that they might, there's no point to reinvent the wheel, basically. I also thought what you said about the fish and chips shop example of their packaging was quite interesting, because I've just done an interview with Mel Marley, who spoke at ZDAY about the peer pressure psychology, that actually people are far more likely to sort of go with a group first, and then a logical, reasonable argument second. And that was quite a good example of that, I thought. Sorry, you wanted to...
I mean, that was just simply from a process of transparency. I mean, we're seeing this anyway, aren't we? We're seeing this transparency, shining the light on so many new things, whether it's, the Panama Papers and where people keep their money, and how the banking system works and all of this sort of stuff. But yeah, at that local level, it was just the idea that here is a digital representation of what people actually think, and that digital representation was enough for certain people to change their behaviour. So there's a lot of psychology around behaviour change, and this is so simple, isn't it? And all you've got to do is actually suggest an idea, rate and debate it and prioritise it, and you're going to get some behaviour change from that. But also, that also then becomes the catalyst, because there's a lot of entrepreneurs that are sitting in communities that are sitting there with that good idea, and as you say, it might not necessarily be a brand new idea. It might just be something that they've seen somewhere else. But there's that risk. The standard business model is, we'll set up and we'll start with one customer, and 3 years later we might break even. While we've aged about 10 years and got our hair out. Whereas through this process, you can suggest your idea on your couch and say, well, and get a feel for starters to see what the temperature is, what the mood is for this particular idea. And if people kind of like it, then you can use that as evidence to move forward to the next step, and start doing some feasibility and research and potentially building a business plan that could then be crowdsourced into whatever type of business, but ideally into some sort of local ownership. I mean, a wind turbine set up in a neighbouring county recently. They managed to crowdsource £350,000 in 4 months. So it doesn't matter whether it's a small project like a food box scheme or a much larger project like that. And the beauty of obviously the bigger projects is that they're creating energy, and then they manage to sell that energy, and that money then comes back into the community as a community benefit fund. So now they've got to have this whole other dialogue around, well, what are we going to spend the money on? And I just love that idea that we can move to communities that are what's called, rather than consuming communities. I mean, there's some examples all over the world, but there's certainly one in Germany that I was reading recently that I think they invested about 30 million, something like that, into their local infrastructure of renewable energy, and now they're getting several million back every year into this community benefit fund, and that's selling energy over and above providing their own energy needs. And so you think about projects like that. If we could replicate that one project into all other communities, so that all communities decide which renewable energy project is right for them, is it hydro, is it wind, is it solar, is it geothermal, which one is it? And then what does it look like? What's the best place for it? And then crowdsource that into community ownership with community share scheme. And if all communities could get to that point where they're prosuming, they're selling excess energy, and then they've got excess money then to invest in local infrastructure and local services, we're talking about communities of abundance and a life of abundance. Here we are in this age of austerity, and to me that's sort of a clear route map of how we go from where we are today through to a future that's much brighter, much more sustainable. And that route map there is really around crowdsourcing tangible projects. And the other side of things, that's sort of direct democracy in a way. And the other side of things is really transforming the representative democracy structure. And again, if you imagine local people starting to really get engaged around their priorities and to express those really clearly, then representatives have finally got some data to represent. At the moment, you ask these representatives, what their priorities are, what the priorities of the community are, and where do they get their data from? As one of your speakers said in the event, where's the evidence for what you need or what this community needs? But if you think about the idea of being a representative, it's an impossible task. No representative could represent thousands of people on, let's just say, 15 major subject matters every month, of ever-changing priorities. It's an impossibility. So that kind of brings you on to something that's called liquid democracy. I don't know whether you've ever heard of it, but the idea of direct democracy is sort of an evolution from representative democracy, because it starts to inform representatives what the local priorities are. But the issue you have then is that, James, if I said, well, now you can have a say on inside all of the communities of interest that are meaningful to you, and that might be, places of education. It might be the boating community. It could be, the zeitgeist community. And then you're getting asked all these different questions, and you end up with 500 or 600 ideas to rate on an awful lot of topics that you don't necessarily know a huge amount about. And liquid democracy basically enables you to delegate or create a relationship with a subject professional and say, well, actually, these 3 or 4 people really know an awful lot about transport or economy or health or any of these major subjects. But to empower those people to make decisions on your behalf or to inform you about how to potentially make decisions. And those subject professionals then start to build a profile up, like people are on Twitter and LinkedIn. But they would be declaring the social and environmental impact of a decision before the event, and basically trying to win your trust and trying to make the best decisions possible. And after the event, after the decision is made, the real impact, social and environmental impact, would be measured. And these people then would either win and lose the trust of the local people. So you get the people that are making the best decisions on behalf of the community starting to emerge, and they would form design teams. And so those sort of design teams would be the ones that inform the representatives. So you really sort of pad out the middle ground if you think of the distance between a representative and those of us in local communities. And in the middle, you've just got this void at the moment. So you really pad out that void with people delegating to each other through subject matter, though, through track record and experience, not through personality. So I think it's the liquid democratic structure that is the potential solution to the representative democratic problem. So you've kind of got two, in my view, you've kind of got the yin and the yang. You've got the representative thing, where you need these people to make policy decisions and changing the policies that are structural decisions within society. And then you've got the practical, crowdsourcing, tangible actions that we need to get on with on the ground. And we do that through, again, we use our subject professionals in liquid democracy, but it's very much about local ownership and directing.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a very interesting concept. It's one I've been meaning to look into, but it certainly sort of seems to chime in with the idea of meritocracy, which I always appealed to me, and in that you actually have people who know what they're talking about in a particular subject area, deal with that area, much like you would have Richard Dawkins is the head of biology at Oxford University, and he's the head of biology at Oxford University because he knows his shit, for want of a better phrase. But you go to government and you've got very often the Chancellor of the Exchequer's never run a business, doesn't know how to run accounts, and let alone really know about economics, but he's got advisors. I mean, what is he? He's a lawyer. I often use the line, lawyers, lawyers aren't trained to run countries. Not that I think that there should be such a thing, but that's for another conversation. And I also wanted to pick up on the point that you mentioned about disengagement in community. I think leads to very often a misanthropic view of humanity in general, and that people don't care. And this is prevalent in very often our members. I see it sometimes in our comments online. Oh, what's the point? We're all going to hell in a handcart. But the third industrial revolution, many of the ideas you were talking about there being proposed by Jeremy Rifkin and being enacted in places like Germany, and even on the small scale, the things like recycling, the fact that people actually put their bins out with recycling in it every week, even if that's, things should be recyclable in the first place. They should be made that way, obviously, but discounting that, people clearly do care. Do you know what I mean? That's the thing, that people clearly do care. And when you give them a platform for that voice, like you were saying, then you start to get engaged community members, and then these ideas that they're giving you are these green ideas. So to say, oh, no one cares about it, they're not bothered. They are bothered, but they need to be brought into the fold, and there needs to be a platform to do that. So I think that that's interesting.
Exactly, James. I have faith in that people do want to make the effort, as you say, and I believe that the evidence points to it. All the issues revolve around systemic issues, as you say around recycling. When we used to have to go down to Tesco's and put everything in the big containers. I mean, I don't know what the percentage of recycling was then, but it would have been an awful lot less than when the council said, right, now what we're going to do is put a box outside everybody's door. And the reality is, the more boxes you put outside people's door, the more effort people will make. If you say, well, now here's a brown box, and in the brown box you're going to put brown glass. I mean, in Japan, I've seen some of those, tiny little flats that they live in, and they've got like 15 holes in the wall where you put everything. And people will make the effort, but you've got to make it easy for them. You've got to put the systems in place to be able to enable them to engage. And we're finding exactly the same thing as far as democratic engagement is concerned. And our we've been focusing mostly in education recently, and so we've built this sort of digital or direct democracy tool called Vocaleyes with a V, and we've been installing that in colleges and universities and schools, primary schools, mainly in South Wales, because that's where we're based, but it's not just South Wales, and Bristol and Birmingham. And if I take one college, for instance, where we installed Neath Port Talbot, and they've got around 11,000 students, and we installed into their intranet last October. And it's just a little widget that sits in the Moodle intranet underneath their name, and it says, James, you've got 6 ideas today. And within 4 months, they've had 1,200 students click on that widget and rate and debate each other's ideas. So some of these ideas are rated 700 times. Now, I mean, it might not sound like a lot, but if you compare it to the existing process, which, as many of you will know, we've all been to college, and if you're familiar with the student rep system, I mean, in some colleges you end up with like 140 student reps. And those really have just been sort of pointed out by either the other students because they look like confident people. It wasn't really an election process. And they're meant to turn up to these meetings every month. And you might get 8 people that turn up to the student rep meeting. And then what are you meant to do? They sort of have a little discussion about the strategy for students, what they think they should be doing. And they might write some notes in a Word document. It's incredibly ineffective. But once you put a process like this in, now you've got this clear printout of priorities rated by thousands of students. And that gives a lot more meaning and purpose to these representatives, because they don't necessarily now have to talk about the ideas as such. Now they're talking about the strategy and doing feasibility. It's like, well, they want a pool table, or they want healthier dinners, or they want to clean the toilets, whatever it is. And then they become the sort of gatekeepers and mediators and facilitators of the most popular ideas, and make sure that they get progressed to SMT for decision making, and make sure that there's feedback from the SMT, and that feedback gets passed back to the student community. So you've got, just by putting in such a simple process like that, it's not the be all and end all. It doesn't fix the process, but it certainly moves us on to a much better place. And one of the visions we have is, because you might know about things like the governments try to have national conversations. So the way they currently do a national conversation is they drive around in a car around the local streets, and they'll stop anyone in the street and they'll say, we'd like you to turn up at this local community centre, and we'll give you £30 for turning up. And then we're going to ask you some questions about a national policy that we're trying to put into place, or that we're trying to gather evidence for. And so you'll get 30 or 40 people, random people, then turning up in this building in a community centre where they're paid £30 cash to turn up, and it's there for them in a brown envelope when they turn up. And then they're asked questions around this national policy. You know, how can we improve the country? You know, or this particular area. And then you've got the whole post-it note thing, and the paper tablecloths, and the big sheets of paper come out. And more often than not, you end up doing things like collage as well. You know, like they'll have cut out all the pictures out of the Sunday Times, and they'll say, right, we want you to stick these pictures onto this paper and paint a picture that you want to see for your country. And believe it or not, I went to one a year or so ago, and we were asked to do posture. I mean, it was being run by a theatre company, and here were all the heads, all of the sort of leading organisations for the environment in this county. And we were asked to do posture, you know, starting to make shapes like trees and, you know, random shapes. I had to leave at that point, and my blood was starting to boil. You know, here we are heading for 6 mass extinction, and here you've got the leaders of all the environmental movements, you know, making all these silly shapes. And I just could not connect how these shapes are actually moving towards some sort of clear strategy that's going to move us, you know, towards a better future. But you know, James, we deserve to go to the wall if we're going to stay this disorganised. The way that we currently devise strategy is generally with post-it notes and paper tablecloths. And you've seen what happens. You know, you get hundreds of these things, and then someone gets delegated to write them up, maybe into a Word document. And if you're really lucky, you'll get that Word document a few months later. But then that's totally not interactive. It's probably out of date by then, and there's no way for us to sort of move that forward into a strategy. It's just really difficult. So one of the things we're advocating for is that we start moving to the phone as the post-it note. You know, and so in events that we run, we use the phone, and people put their ideas into the phone, and it appears up on the big screen immediately. And then that's being rated and debated by everybody else in the room, and the priorities emerge within half an hour. So I was working at Cardiff Uni recently, and we had 56 students in the room, and within 30 minutes we had about 40 priorities. You know, they'd all logged on through their mobile phones without any trouble whatsoever, and there it was. So these are our priorities. And the beauty of that is, and you don't even have to do that bit in the room. You know, you can actually start the conversation several weeks or months before any consultation event. And then when you get to the room, you can start to move on to working groups and say, well, look, here are some clear priorities. Who in the room is interested in some of these top priorities and prepared to start a working group? And then with the working group, you can go away and do your feasibility and research on this, and come back and do a little presentation in 2 weeks' time and tell us, you know, what it is we need to do to be able to move this forward as a project. And there's a group called Assemblies for Democracy that I don't know if you've heard of them, but they run a few events last year and the year before in London, Manchester, and Glasgow. And again, you know, they were debating the antiquated political system. But again, they were doing it on post-it notes. So when I found their website, like, I was really excited to find out this group called Assemblies for Democracy. That's fantastic. But then there's no way to have a conversation with them, you know. And then they're just running the occasional in-person event with post-it notes. And I was like, well, where's the assembly? How does anybody get engaged? And so I offered to add a digital component to that assembly, and we started running Assemblies for Democracy in Swansea last year around August. And then a month later, Jeremy Corbyn got elected, and one of the first things he was saying and advocating for was that people need to come together in their communities and their district and start running local assemblies and identifying their local priorities. So, you know, we were really chuffed that we'd started running ours a month or so earlier. But what's interesting about the Corbyn thing, it's the same as well. You know, a year or so earlier, Russell Brand was advocating for the same thing, saying that people should really come together and do, you know, and identify their local priorities in people's assemblies or local assemblies, whatever. And in some of the groups, like you go to the Labour groups, and there's various different Labour groups in Wales, certainly Momentum and Labour Left and Grassroots Labour and all of these different things. You go to these things, and most of them are focusing on how can we get Jeremy Corbyn elected. And look, as I hear it, they're not really listening to what Jeremy Corbyn's saying. It's like, so I'm usually the only one that pipes up in the room and says, well, what are we going to do about what Jeremy Corbyn's actually saying, which is let's get on with it, and let's get on with the work. And do you not realise or see that if we get on with the work, we're going to create some really empowered groups. We're going to get some tangible things done. Before you know it, Jeremy Corbyn's going to come down to visit us, and it's going to be that sort of sense of empowerment that gets Jeremy Corbyn elected in the long term. So that's kind of the area that we're working on in Assemblies for Democracy. And we've got another sort of event in a couple of weeks' time. And one of the key things we were asking is, like, how can we bring these people together into a room and have these consultations, but then create a process that is empowering, so you don't get this drop off? Because normally, I'm sure you'll know, you go to these consultations or these events, like a new group sets up, and then within a couple of weeks, or they're saying there's another event in a couple of weeks or whatever, and the energy just sort of dies and dissipates and dissipates. And certainly that's happened with most transition towns, for instance. How can you start these conversations with a sort of a process that builds energy, not loses energy? And that's one of the key things that we're asking. And referring to the transition towns, I mean, I've witnessed so many transition towns come together with such a high level of energy. They have their thing called the Grand Unleashing. They've managed to engage hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the local community, and then they all kind of get engaged in local projects. And some of those projects have been really successful. But the issue being that you've got all these volunteers that then put all of their heart and soul and their effort into these single projects, and they end up burning out. And if you take the title of transition, which is to transition towns, so your job, or the job as a group, is to transition this town from where we are today through to a sustainable future, and that's this job. How do you engage? The issue they've always had is, how do you engage a wider community? And what I've witnessed is, that those groups come together and then they end up dwindling. And I think one of the issues that they've had is that no one's holding the space of asking the question. And I really think that the answer lies, in a kind of paradoxical way, in the ability to ask the question, so that you can start to engage other people in the local area and find out what their answers are. Even if the answers are the same, they're suggesting it, they're prioritising it, and they're taking ownership of it. And in that way, you can draw more people in. And I think, Transition Town sets up lots of different subgroups, like heart and soul and transport and all these sorts of things. But one of the subgroups that isn't there is the ability to ask the question, to hold that core space. And I think that's kind of what Assemblies for Democracy, or I'd like to see Assemblies for Democracy doing, is they're a group that they pledge not to get into any projects, or not to get into any projects that's going to interfere with their ability to put effort into help people and empower people to have the conversation. And I think that's the bit that's been missing. And another bit that's missing from these types of groups is there's no one really talking about technology, because a lot of them are so community focused. They, you bring up the word technology and it's like, oh, Satan's walking the room, And it's like, well, if you think about Avaz and 38 degrees and some of the massive social movements that have happened on the planet, they're all underpinned by technology. Whether it's Podemos Party in Spain, that they've used the open source platform Lumio. There's the Red Party in Argentina that used another open source project called Democracy OS. There was Iceland, obviously, that went bankrupt, and then they decided to have a go at creating a citizens' constitution, and they used a digital platform called Your Priorities. So, digital underpins a lot of the really successful claimant that any of those were successful, but they underpin these big movements. But it's not a conversation we're having in these meetings. We're not saying, well, clearly we need to create a working group that researches the digital tools that are available that can help us really, help us achieve our aims.
Absolutely, Peter. And Fantastic points raised along the way there. I do hope our listeners were taking notes. It's a wealth of information and topics that you're raising. But I think it's I think it's time to close. Otherwise, we may well make this radio show the longest in TZM global history for nothing else other than the interest that it's the interesting subject area. But no, don't please don't apologise. I was listening avidly. It was very interesting. But I was just just to sort of close out the conversation for this particular instalment. I think could potentially be one in the future, because there's some very interesting topics being raised, perhaps with a wider panel or something. But for now, how can people get involved in the project?
Okay, so the domain name is vocaleyes.org, and it's vocaleyes .org. Make sure you don't go to vocaleyes.co.uk, because that's a screen reader for the blind. So quite a different project. Even though you could probably use the screen reader for the blind and look at vocaleyes.org, maybe there'll be some sort of collaboration in the future. So you could go there and make an inquiry. And interestingly, actually, one of our coders is from the Zeitgeist movement. Well, it came from the Zeitgeist, a mailing list and stuff like that. So, yeah, and in terms of the skills, we'd really like to build on the business model. We'd like to really understand much better in terms of the open source model. We're half open source. We want to go fully open source. We'd like to be cooperative, this sort of stuff. But we want to match that with the ability to be able to bring in investment. And I think when we set up the company, there wasn't so much crowdsourcing around back then. It wasn't so popular as it is today. So it's about striking that balance. You've got the Googles and the Facebooks of this world that have actually delivered more social impact than any social enterprise ever could, in a sense, or ever could in the past. And that was certainly the thinking back then, was that we probably need to be the standard commercial enterprise to be able to raise that sort of level of investment to have that sort of impact. I'm not so sure that that's the case, and I think maybe a new model could be could be the way forward. So certainly anyone that is interested in that side of things, anyone that's interested in coding, PHP and MySQL, that side of thing, anyone that's really wants to get engaged in their community. What community are you passionate about, and wants to sort of enhance enhance the sort of community voice of that, whether it's parent voice or student voice or the local community voice, whichever. Someone that wants to be a coordinator to amplify that voice, in terms of then using that data to progress into working groups and present to other representatives. So anything like that.
I'm sure you're in safe company here. Many of the things that you've mentioned, especially due to collaboration using technology, is something we're very big on here in the Zeitgeist movement. So hopefully there'll be people out there who see sympathise and empathise with the merit of what you're saying and want to get involved. Any
philanthropists, we're very underfunded.
Yeah. That's the issue with many of these fantastic ideas, is underfunding, and hopefully one that's we're going to discuss in a future show coming up soon, to do with economics and all those sorts of things. But certainly the fact it's out there being done, and you're doing it and are clearly passionate about it, is a fantastic thing, and highly commendable, I must say. So I think that's been a fantastic show, Peter. I hope you feel the same, and perhaps we'll see you again in the future. But I suppose for this instalment, it's probably time to call it to a close. So thanks very much for joining us today. And if you've got any parting words you'd like to say?
Well, shall we say thanks to Peter Joseph, for inspiring us all in the first place?
Yeah, he did a pretty good job on that first flick, didn't he? Yes, yeah. Peter certainly does do a fine job of eloquating this direction, and has certainly put in the hours at the helm. So yes, yeah, and but likewise to the whole community who's got behind the drive. I mean, I think Peter would be one to say that the ideas are something that culminate in individuals and things, and he was really the vehicle for a lot of the ideas that he'd picked up through circumstance and things as well. And it's kind of a helpful way of looking at things, I think. But yeah, definitely definitely concur with that. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us, Peter, and I hope everyone wants to get involved. So yeah, thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again soon.
All right, James. Thanks so much for the invitation. Speak again soon. Bye for now.
Bye bye.